It was supposed to be a triumphant return, a moment of pride, purpose, and redemption. But instead, what unfolded that day in Toronto felt like a hollow echo of what once was. Cameras clicked, flags waved, veterans stood waiting, expecting to feel something: admiration, connection, gratitude. And yet, as Prince Harry finished his speech, the silence was deafening. No applause, no nods, just stillness. The kind of silence that cuts through the air and makes even the speaker wonder if he's still being heard at all. Imagine it for a moment. A prince who once inspired thousands of wounded soldiers, now facing a crowd that couldn't bring themselves to clap. What happened? What changed? How did the man once celebrated as the people's prince, the veteran who created the Invictus Games, the one who stood shoulder to shoulder with heroes, end up standing alone, emotionally, politically, and perhaps morally? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. That moment in Toronto wasn't just awkward. It was symbolic, a sign of something deeper, something that had been brewing quietly behind palace doors, PR offices, and media headlines. The truth? This wasn't about a bad speech. It was about authenticity and the painful cost of losing it. But before we unpack the silence, let's rewind to what the world expected. Prince Harry had come to Canada to speak to veterans, his brothers and sisters in arms. People who, for years, had admired his commitment to them. This was his arena, his legacy, his heart. After all, Harry wasn't just another royal with a ceremonial uniform. He was one of them, a soldier who served in Afghanistan, a man who knew the sting of war and the struggle of coming home. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. So when word got out that Harry would be addressing veterans again, in Toronto, of all places, the birthplace of the Invictus Games, expectations were sky high. Organizers promised a heartfelt message about courage, sacrifice, and brotherhood. The stage was perfectly set. Lights dimmed, cameras rolled, and then he began to speak. At first, it sounded fine, smooth, polished, almost too polished. His words flowed like lines rehearsed from a movie script, the kind of speech that looks powerful on paper, but somehow feels weightless in the air. Veterans in the audience exchanged glances. Something didn't feel right. There was no raw emotion, no grit, no genuine connection, just distant phrases about unity, resilience, and shared purpose. And when he finished, there was that moment, that crushing pause, the one that stretches forever, begging for applause that never comes. For a man who'd been cheered on global stages, the silence that followed was humiliating. The cameras stopped rolling, but the awkwardness lingered like smoke. So why didn't anyone clap? Was it the speech, the delivery, or was it the man himself? That's where the story takes a darker turn, one that exposes more than just a poorly received address. Because behind those carefully chosen words, behind the royal smile and rehearsed pauses, there was something else, something scripted, artificial, and entirely out of touch. What if I told you that the speech wasn't written by Prince Harry at all? What if I told you that the same team responsible for Meghan Markle's media projects had crafted every single line, not to honor veterans, but to polish an image? And what if the veterans sitting in that audience somehow sensed it? That they knew, instinctively, this wasn't a soldier talking to soldiers. This was a celebrity talking to cameras. That single realization is what transformed that quiet room into one of the most revealing moments of Harry's post-royal life. Because it wasn't just silence, it was rejection. Think about how far he's fallen since those early days. The uniform, the helicopter missions, the laughter and brotherhood among soldiers who trusted him. The man who once carried the hopes of veterans around the world now stood on a stage, reading lines someone else had written, in a city that once loved him, and they couldn't even bring themselves to clap. Maybe it wasn't just the words. Maybe it was the disconnect. For years, Harry has spoken about compassion, truth, and integrity. But this time, his tone felt hollow, as if he'd forgotten what it truly means to speak from the heart. The audience could feel that. You could see it in their faces, veterans folding their arms, journalists glancing awkwardly at each other, a few heads shaking subtly as if to say, he's lost it. And yet, the cameras captured none of that. The official footage, released later, showed a tight, edited angle. Just Harry at the podium, his voice clear and confident. But what you didn't see was the empty emotion in the room. The journalists' whispers, The polite smiles that disappeared as soon as the cameras stopped rolling. Because this wasn't just a failed speech. It was a moment that symbolized how much has changed and how much has been lost since Harry stepped away from royal duty. The veterans who once saluted him now saw someone else entirely, a man shaped by PR, detached from his own story. And here's the twist. That speech, the one so carefully staged, wasn't meant to move the veterans at all. It was meant to move Netflix executives. Sources close to the event later revealed that the Toronto visit was tied to a behind-the-scenes documentary pitch, a powerful visual narrative about Harry reconnecting with his military roots. Every angle, every line, every handshake was reportedly planned to rebuild his public image, not his relationship with the soldiers. But something backfired. The veterans weren't actors. They didn't respond to cues or camera cuts. They were real people, and they could sense when someone was performing for the wrong reasons. To them, this wasn't a reunion. It was an exploitation. And the silence? That was their protest. One attendee described it later. He looked at us like he was waiting for applause. But we weren't clapping for a show. We were waiting for him to speak to us, not at us. That's the moment everything changed. Because silence, in that room, spoke volumes. It revealed something deeper than any tabloid headline or PR spin could ever say, that the public's patience with performance has run out. But let's go deeper. Because Toronto wasn't chosen at random. It was symbolic, the birthplace of the Invictus Games, where Harry once stood as a proud founder. The place where he met Meghan Markle. The city that once adored him. And now, it had become the setting for his most public embarrassment. How did that happen? How did the hero of Invictus become the man veterans couldn't connect with? It wasn't just about the words. It was about everything surrounding them. The planning, the intent, the invisible hands shaping the message behind closed doors. Multiple insiders have hinted that the speech was drafted by a professional communication strategist, someone with no military background, no understanding of what service means, and no emotional connection to the cause. Their goal wasn't to honor veterans. It was to rebuild trust with audiences. The veterans were props in a redemption story, one that never landed. And if you listen closely to the speech itself, you can hear it. The artificial tone, the PR buzzwords, the absence of lived experience. It's the difference between someone saying, "I understand your pain," and someone who's actually felt it. But here's what makes this story even more fascinating and tragic. There was a time when Harry didn't need scripts. When his authenticity was his power. When his raw emotion connected him to people around the world. He was imperfect, but real. Vulnerable, but relatable. That's what made him stand out from the rest of the royal family. He didn't hide behind protocol. Yet in Toronto, he hid behind a teleprompter. And the veterans saw it. They saw the distance. They felt it. And their silence became the loudest message of the night. Now, the world has begun asking the same question. Has Harry forgotten who he is? It's a haunting question, because in that moment, he seemed like a man trapped between two worlds. The soldier and the celebrity. The prince and the product. The human being and the brand. And somewhere between those two identities, he lost the room. But this story isn't over, not even close. Because what happened after that speech is even more shocking than the silence that followed it. Leaked documents, private messages, insider accounts, all pointing to one disturbing truth, that the entire Toronto event was never meant to be heartfelt at all. It was planned, scripted, controlled, down to the last applause cue. The only thing they couldn't control was the audience. And that's where everything began to unravel. Because soon after that awkward night, whispers started to spread from veteran circles, media contacts, even people inside Archwell itself. Whispers that suggested the entire speech was part of a much larger narrative. One that had nothing to do with the military and everything to do with the Markle brand. And if that sounds too far-fetched, remember this. Toronto was also where Harry and Meghan first went public. Where the Invictus Games became not just an event, but a backdrop for their personal story. And now, years later, it had become the setting for a rebrand gone wrong. The irony couldn't be stronger. The man who once spoke from his soul, now reading someone else's words. The audience he once inspired, now unmoved. The applause that once followed him everywhere, replaced by cold, unbroken silence. It wasn't just the end of a speech. It felt like the end of something bigger, The last flicker of authenticity from a man who once stood for more than headlines. But if you think this silence was painful, wait until you hear what was happening behind the scenes. Because those who worked on that event, the planners, the publicists, even some within the team, knew something wasn't right from the very start. They knew the veterans weren't buying it. And they knew that once the truth came out, about who wrote the speech, why it was written, and what it was really meant to achieve, the silence in that room would echo far beyond Toronto. The day began with fanfare. Toronto's downtown streets shimmered with autumn sunlight, flags waving from street poles, camera crews clustering near the convention center. The banners read, "Honoring our heroes," and beneath them, veterans arrived in quiet groups, some in uniform, some in plain jackets, each bearing medals and memories. They didn't come for glamour. They came for something simple: respect. A word they believed Prince Harry once understood better than most. But by the end of that day, that word, respect, would hang in the air like a ghost, unspoken and broken. Prince Harry's arrival was marked by the usual media circus. Black SUVs, polished security men with earpieces, the flash of lenses bouncing off tinted windows. The city had seen royals before, but this felt different. There was curiosity, not excitement. Skepticism, not celebration. Reporters whispered among themselves. "Let's see how this one goes," one muttered. "He needs this speech to land." And they were right. For weeks, the event had been framed as a powerful homecoming, not to the monarchy, but to purpose. The man who'd given the world the Invictus Games was returning to where it all began. It should have been emotional. It should have been easy. Veterans loved him once. But as the hall filled, there was an odd stillness. People looked around, waiting to feel the spark that once came naturally with his name. Then he walked in. He wore a simple navy suit, tailored, elegant, modestly royal. He smiled as he took the stage, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. The lights dimmed. Cameras clicked. The teleprompter blinked. "Good afternoon," he began. His voice was steady, confident, but rehearsed. Too rehearsed. Every syllable seemed perfectly measured, like he was trying to remember where to breathe. He paused for effect, or perhaps to gauge the room. A few polite smiles, a nod from the front row, but no energy, no warmth. Then came the opening lines, about bravery, unity, and sacrifice. Words that should have drawn emotion. But they fell flat. They didn't sound lived in. They sounded written, as if he were quoting someone else's definition of courage. At first, people tried to engage. They listened politely. But the deeper he went into his speech, the more distant he seemed. His eyes didn't meet the veterans. He looked past them, toward the cameras, the lenses, the invisible audience online. One veteran, a man in his 60s with medals spanning his chest, leaned over to his friend and whispered, "He's reading to them, not talking to us." And that's exactly what it felt like. Every story Harry told, about soldiers overcoming injury, about the strength of the human spirit, felt stripped of rawness. They were sound bites, carefully packaged, tested lines that could fit neatly into a social media clip. The audience shifted. Some folded their arms. Others checked their watches. The silence grew heavier. Harry didn't seem to notice, or maybe he did, but couldn't stop. He pushed through the lines, his tone dipping slightly as he reached the halfway mark. You could almost hear the internal script ticking in his head. He smiled where he was supposed to, paused where it was planned, nodded at pre-written emotional beats. But the veterans weren't reacting. You could sense the disconnect growing, like static between two radios on different frequencies. The cameras still rolled, but the energy was gone. It wasn't a room full of admiration anymore. It was a room full of confusion. Because this wasn't the Prince Harry they remembered. They remembered the man who'd once laughed with wounded soldiers, swapping jokes, sitting on the floor of hospitals. The man who'd cried with families of the fallen. The man who didn't need notes to say thank you. That man spoke from the gut. This one spoke from a script. And it showed. As he neared the end, he began the gratitude section, thanking Canada for its courage, veterans for their service, families for their sacrifice. It should have been the emotional crescendo. Instead, it felt like a closing paragraph to an email. And together, we will continue to honor the spirit of those who served. Then he stopped, looked up, smiled, waited, but nothing came. No applause, no murmurs, no energy, just stillness. A reporter later described the moment perfectly. It felt like time froze, like everyone was waiting for someone else to start clapping, but no one wanted to be the first. Harry shifted slightly, gave another smile, a nervous one this time. The kind people were when they realize something isn't working. He nodded once, said, "Thank you," and walked off stage. The veterans stayed seated. Some gave him polite nods as he passed, but most didn't move. A few clapped half-heartedly after he left, but by then, the cameras had already cut. The silence wasn't out of disrespect. It was out of disappointment. For many of those men and women, this was their first time seeing Harry since his royal exit. The man who'd once been their champion, now living in a California mansion, preaching about service while surrounded by celebrity. They'd hoped the old Harry would return that day. But the man who stood before them wasn't the soldier they remembered. He was a spokesman, a polished figure molded by PR and strategy. Afterward, as the crowd filed out, the air buzzed with quiet conversations. One veteran muttered, "That didn't sound like him." Another added, "It sounded like one of those Netflix scripts." And that's when the rumors started, small whispers at first, then louder as the hours passed. Did he even write it? Because something about that speech felt off. Too generic, too smooth, missing the fire and imperfection that made Harry's early speeches unforgettable. Later that evening, local reporters gathered at a nearby pub to debrief. Their notes were thin, not because the event lacked coverage, but because there was nothing to say. No standout moment. No laughter. No tears. Just a perfectly structured, emotionally sterile monologue. One journalist looked up from his drink and said, "It's like watching an actor deliver a eulogy for a stranger." And that became the theme of the night, that Harry, in trying to look perfect, had lost the very imperfection that once made him powerful. But here's the strange part. It wasn't just the audience who felt it. Members of his own team reportedly did too. One insider later described the backstage energy as uneasy. People sensed something was wrong before he even went on stage. He was distant, the source said. Usually he'd chat, crack a joke, loosen up. That day, he barely spoke to anyone, just rehearsed the lines again and again. It was as if he was performing, not participating. When he walked off the stage, someone from his team approached and whispered, "Good job." Harry gave a faint smile, but didn't respond. He knew. Everyone knew. Because applause isn't just about sound. It's about connection. And that connection, that spark between a man and his audience, was gone. But why? That's the question that haunted the days that followed. How could a man so loved, so respected by soldiers, fail so completely in front of them? Theories began to swirl. Some said it was nerves. Others said burnout. But the real explanation, the one no one dared to say publicly, was simpler and far more damaging. They believed he didn't mean it. And that belief spread quickly. Within hours, online discussions among veterans lit up. Posts titled, "What happened to him?" And that didn't sound like the Harry we knew, gained traction. The clips that were supposed to go viral for all the right reasons started trending for all the wrong ones. Comment sections filled with the same word again and again, empty. His words were empty. His eyes looked empty. The whole thing felt empty. It wasn't the speech that failed. It was the man behind it. And behind the polished delivery, there were cracks. Cracks that hinted at something orchestrated, something planned far beyond a simple veterans event. Because according to multiple insiders, the speech wasn't really meant for the veterans in that room. It was meant for someone else entirely. Someone in Hollywood. Someone who believed this event could help rebuild an image that had been slipping away. That's when the whispers started about the script. A document said to have circulated among his PR team weeks before the event. A script outlining not just what he'd say, but how he'd say it. Which pauses to take. Which camera angles to favor. It was all choreographed. All designed to create a certain image. The humble prince, the devoted veteran, the humanitarian at heart. But real heroes can tell the difference between sincerity and strategy. And that's why, when he walked off that stage, the silence said everything. It wasn't anger. It wasn't disrespect. It was realization. The veterans realized they were watching a performance. Harry realized he'd lost their faith. And his team realized they'd miscalculated everything. But no one, not even the most seasoned PR strategist, could have predicted what would happen next. Because in the days that followed, one of those insiders broke the unspoken rule of royal secrecy. They came forward. They told the truth about that speech, who wrote it, why it was written, and what it was truly meant to achieve. And once that truth surfaced, the silence from that room would suddenly make sense. Because as it turned out, Harry's speech from the heart didn't come from his heart at all. It came from a laptop 3,000 miles away. They said he poured his heart into it, that the words came from the depths of his own reflection, from a man who'd lived through war, loss, and rebirth. But when the curtain fell and the applause never came, the truth began to seep out through the cracks. The truth that those heartfelt words, every polished sentence, every emotional beat, every carefully crafted pause, didn't belong to him at all. It all started with a single email, a message that would later circulate among journalists and staff, sent just 2 weeks before the Toronto event. The subject line was simple: Speech Framework, Canada Veterans Address, Final Draft. Attached to it was a document, polished, detailed, and unmistakably written in a style that didn't sound like Harry's voice. That email wasn't sent from a military liaison. It wasn't even from the Invictus Foundation. It came from a California-based PR firm linked to Archwell, the same company that had reportedly crafted some of Meghan Markle's interviews and speeches. And that's where the story takes its turn. Because the real shock wasn't that Prince Harry had help writing his speech. Every public figure does. The shock was in how much of it wasn't his, and what the speech was truly designed to achieve. When one of Harry's former aides saw the final draft, their reaction was instant. It didn't sound like him, the aide said. Harry always speaks in a way that's messy but real. You can tell he's thinking as he goes. This was perfect. Too perfect. Every phrase was corporate, polished within an inch of its life. Phrases like shared human tapestry, synergistic resilience, and collective transformation. The kind of vocabulary that sounds powerful on stage, but means almost nothing in real life. And yet, there it was, his name stamped on the bottom, his signature line. Together, we honor the past by shaping a better tomorrow. The kind of closing line that would make a PR strategist beam, but would make a veteran roll their eyes. So what went wrong? To understand that, we have to go back a few weeks before the event, back to Montecito, where the planning began. Insiders claim that the Toronto trip wasn't Harry's idea at all. It was proposed by a senior consultant hired by Archwell after their Netflix project performance started slipping. The idea was to reconnect Harry with his strongest narrative, the soldier turned humanitarian. Except the focus wasn't on sincerity. It was on optics. Meetings were held over Zoom, where presentation slides outlined visual positioning goals. One slide reportedly read, "Rebuild public trust through authentic emotional expression." Ironically, the phrase authentic emotional expression had its own bullet point plan, detailing how to manufacture it. That's when this speech framework document came into play. Drafted by a communication strategist with a background not in military affairs, but in entertainment branding. Her resume included celebrity campaign slogans, influencer partnerships, and impact storytelling. Not a single reference to veterans or military culture. And yet, she was the one writing the words Harry would say to them. According to leaked snippets shared later with British tabloids, her early draft read more like a movie trailer than a military tribute. Phrases like, "Our stories are not bound by blood but by belief, and in every soldier's eyes, I see the reflection of a better world," filled the pages. Beautiful words, yes, but hollow, because they weren't his. A member of the planning team reportedly suggested that Harry revise it personally, to add his own tone, his own stories. But he never did. One insider revealed. He said he'd look at it, but he was overwhelmed with other commitments. By the time the final version was approved, it had gone through so many PR filters that his own voice was lost. And that was the fatal mistake. Because authenticity doesn't survive in a boardroom. It can't be refined into perfection. The cracks, the unpolished edges, that's what people connect to. That's what veterans respect. And by the time Harry took that stage in Toronto, every trace of imperfection had been scrubbed out of him. Even the gestures were rehearsed. During a practice session at the venue the night before, Harry was reportedly coached on where to pause for emotional impact, which way to turn for the cameras, even when to glance down at his notes to seem thoughtful. Imagine that. A prince rehearsing sincerity. A member of the tech team later admitted, "It was weird to watch. He was trying, but you could tell he didn't feel it." The director kept saying, "Pause here, look right, smile, like it was a commercial. The problem wasn't that Harry couldn't connect. It was that he wasn't being allowed to. The entire event had become an orchestrated production, a stage-managed redemption arc designed to look genuine while saying nothing real. And the veterans could sense it. Because real soldiers know when someone's bluffing. It's in the eyes. It's in the way a man talks about loss, about fear, about brotherhood. You can't fake that. You can memorize the words, but not the weight behind them. The veterans sitting in that audience weren't responding to the words. They were responding to the absence of truth. But here's the irony. Harry didn't even realize how far removed he'd become from the message he was delivering. According to someone close to the process, he'd trusted his team completely. He assumed they'd know what tone would work best. He wanted to focus on delivery, not the draft. That trust cost him dearly. Because once the audience felt the disconnect, there was no coming back from it. And what made it worse was what happened after the event. A few hours later, one of the speechwriters, the same strategist behind the California firm, posted a subtle but telling message on her professional account. So proud to have helped craft words that matter. Those 7 words were enough to set the rumor mill on fire. Within hours, screenshots spread online. Forums, blogs, and royal watchers began connecting the dots. Veterans associations started questioning why Harry hadn't written his own message for an event honoring their sacrifices. The backlash was immediate. How can you talk about authenticity when your own words aren't yours? One veteran wrote. We didn't need Hollywood emotion. We needed honesty. And it wasn't just veterans. Even the public began noticing the shift. Clips of the speech flooded social media, but not for the reasons his PR team had hoped. Comments poured in. It sounds like he's reading a press release. That's not the Harry who once spoke from the heart. Why does this feel like an audition? The optics backfired spectacularly. The very script that was meant to redeem him had revealed the exact opposite, that he'd become more brand than man. But the real blow came when a second version of the speech surfaced. A leaked early draft. The one Harry was supposed to give before it was rewritten. And that version was different. Raw. Emotional. Simple. It spoke about his deployment days, about losing friends, about the nights he couldn't sleep. It mentioned the veterans who'd inspired him during the early days of Invictus. It even had an unscripted section, a planned pause for him to share a personal reflection, whatever came to mind in that moment. That's the speech people expected. That's the speech that would have moved the room. But it never saw the light of day. Because someone, somewhere in that chain of approval, decided it was too vulnerable. That it didn't fit the narrative they were building. So they stripped it. Replaced his emotion with eloquence. Replaced sincerity with strategy. And that's when Harry lost his voice. Not metaphorically, but literally. Because when you start reading someone else's words long enough, you forget what your own sound like. The silence in Toronto wasn't the audience turning on him. It was the universe holding up a mirror, showing him how far he drifted from the man he once was. And that's the real tragedy. A prince who once spoke from his soul, now echoing someone else's sentences. A man once defined by service, now defined by scripts. But the silence after that speech did something no PR team could predict. It forced people to start asking questions. Who was behind this? Who decided those were the words Harry should say? And most importantly, who benefited from it? Because as the investigation continued, names began surfacing. Emails leaked. And one in particular stood out. The name of the person who had written the final version of the speech. Someone who'd been quietly influencing not just Harry's words, but his public image for months. Someone close. Very close. When her identity came out, it would confirm what many had suspected all along, that this event wasn't about veterans at all. It was about rebuilding a brand. And the person behind that brand wasn't Prince Harry. Not anymore. Because as one insider put it, the moment that speech hit the stage, it stopped being his story and became hers. But who was she? And how did she end up writing words meant to heal soldiers, while quietly shaping the downfall of a prince? You're about to find out. Because the real author of Prince Harry's speech wasn't a soldier, wasn't a royal, and wasn't even in the room that day. She was 3,000 miles away, and she knew exactly what she was doing. But what she didn't know was how badly it would all backfire. The revelation didn't explode like a bomb. It leaked like a slow, poisonous drip. At first, no one believed it. Then the whispers started to spread through quiet newsroom calls, PR Slack channels, and hushed dinner conversations in Montecito. There was a name, a familiar one, attached to Prince Harry's Toronto speech. And when it surfaced, it confirmed every suspicion about what the event really was. A scripted act of brand rehabilitation disguised as patriotism. The name was Jessica Irwin, a Los Angeles-based image strategist and longtime associate of Meghan Markle's media team. Jessica wasn't a speechwriter in the traditional sense. She wasn't political. She wasn't military. She wasn't even British. She was, however, a master of emotional manipulation, the kind of professional hired to make celebrities appear authentically vulnerable while staying fully in control of their public narrative. Her clients included actors, influencers, and a handful of public figures in crisis. Her job was to craft stories that sounded real, even when they weren't. And now, she'd written words for a prince. According to leaked internal communications, Jessica was brought in 6 weeks before the Toronto event under a confidential contract. The project brief wasn't labeled veteran speech. It was labeled redemption narrative. That alone says everything. Her task: reposition Prince Harry as a misunderstood hero, a man disconnected from his roots but ready to reclaim them. The veterans, the setting, the tone, all chosen as emotional props in what one insider described as a cinematic act of redemption. Emails from her office outlined key deliverables: emotional pacing, social media resonance, and optical cohesion with the Archwell messaging plan. In other words, the speech was designed not to touch hearts in the room, but to go viral online. But Jessica didn't act alone. Her client wasn't Harry, it was Meghan. Sources close to Archwell claim Meghan had pushed for Jessica's involvement after concerns about Harry's ability to stay on message. She reportedly said, "We need consistency. His tone shifts too much, sometimes too raw, sometimes too royal." In other words, the same imperfection that made Harry beloved was now considered a liability. So Jessica was tasked with refining him. She studied past interviews, analyzed his old speeches, and extracted common emotional phrases that worked well on camera. Then she built a composite voice, not Harry's real one, but an algorithmic version of it. The result? A speech that sounded vaguely like him, but lacked everything that made him human. And that's exactly what the veterans in Toronto had felt, the ghost of sincerity haunting a hollow performance. Behind the scenes, Jessica's strategy memo painted an even clearer picture. One section read, "Harry's emotional authority derives from his service identity. Reinforce that while minimizing self-doubt." Another, "Avoid referencing real names or events from his military tenure. Keep tone universal for broader relatability." In simpler terms, strip out the truth, replace it with generic emotion. It's no wonder the veterans sat in silence. But the real scandal wasn't that Jessica wrote it. It was that she bragged about it. Just 24 hours after the event, she posted an Instagram story, a photo of a laptop screen showing her final speech draft. The caption read, "So proud to help share words of healing and unity. Hashtag Toronto, hashtag speechwriting, hashtag impact." Within hours, it was screenshotted and shared across veteran networks, royal forums, and media outlets. Comments flooded in. "Words of healing?" One user wrote. "He couldn't even heal the room." Another added, "You mean you wrote it? That explains why it sounded like a Hallmark card." Jessica deleted the post within minutes, but it was too late. The damage was done. Reporters reached out for clarification. Archwell declined to comment. So did Buckingham Palace. But silence speaks volumes. And that silence set off a wave of outrage, not just from the public, but from within Harry's own circle. A former royal communications aide, speaking anonymously, said, "It's one thing for him to use a writer. It's another to let an influencer-style consultant script his military story. It cheapened everything." Even those who had defended Harry for years found it hard to justify this one. Because this wasn't a slip-up, it was a betrayal of his own legacy. For veterans, it felt personal. One Canadian soldier wrote in an open letter, "You looked us in the eye and spoke someone else's truth. You wore our badges, but carried Hollywood's script. That's not leadership, that's performance." The letter went viral. The phrase "Hollywood script" became a meme, shared with clips of Harry's speech and sarcastic hashtags like hashtag Oscar for Harry. The once revered veteran prince had become a punchline. And yet, inside Montecito, sources said the reaction was bafflingly detached. Meghan reportedly dismissed the backlash as tabloid hysteria, saying, People always overreact when Harry's honest. But that was the point. He wasn't honest. Not this time. And deep down, Harry knew it. One insider described the days after Toronto as tense. Harry, normally cheerful after public events, was reportedly silent on the flight home. He didn't speak much, the source said. He just stared out the window. You could tell he knew he'd lost them. The veterans, the public, everyone. It wasn't guilt about the silence. It was the realization that his own voice no longer belonged to him. Because here's the cruel truth. The more Harry tried to reclaim control of his narrative, the more he lost it to others. Jessica's script was just the latest example in a long pattern. A life turned into content, every emotion filtered through someone else's pen. But not everyone inside Archwell agreed with how it was handled. A staffer reportedly sent a private message to a friend that later leaked to the press. We told them not to use Jessica. She's great at selling empathy, but terrible at sincerity. And yet, they went ahead anyway. Why? Because sincerity doesn't always sell. But spectacle does. Toronto wasn't meant to be heartfelt. It was meant to be shareable. And that's what broke the illusion. You can control the lighting, the camera angles, even the applause cues, but you can't fake resonance. When Jessica's name hit the headlines, publicists scrambled to contain the story. A statement was drafted claiming Harry had worked closely with a small team of writers and editors to ensure accuracy. But the veterans community wasn't buying it. You don't need a team to tell the truth, one veteran said during a radio interview. You just need courage. The fallout snowballed fast. By the following week, several veteran organizations that had previously partnered with Archwell quietly distanced themselves. Invitations were withdrawn. Plans for a follow-up charity event in Vancouver were canceled. Behind the scenes, Harry was reportedly furious. Not at the veterans, at the team. He felt betrayed, one insider said. He said, "This was supposed to be mine." But even then, he didn't realize how deep the betrayal ran. Because Jessica Irwin wasn't working alone. She had been collaborating with another PR consultant, someone within Archwell's inner circle, whose name would soon leak, too. Together, they had designed a full redemption campaign, of which the Toronto speech was just Act 1. The next planned phase? A docu-style special for Netflix, titled Return to Service. It was meant to feature footage of the Toronto event, paired with voiceovers about reflection and purpose. But after the disastrous reception, Netflix quietly shelved it. The platform's executives, once eager to feature Harry's renewed journey, reportedly described the footage as emotionally flat. That cancellation marked the end of the Toronto project, but the beginning of something far worse, scrutiny. Because now the media wanted to know what else had been staged. And the more they dug, the more they found. Every speech, every appearance, every candid moment began to look suspiciously rehearsed. Even veteran groups in the UK started asking if earlier Invictus appearances had been similarly choreographed. Harry's credibility wasn't just damaged, it was disintegrating. And in the center of the storm stood one woman, Jessica Irwin, who had vanished from the public eye as quickly as she appeared. Her accounts went private, her website went offline, and her PR firm released a one-line statement. "We do not comment on client work." But it was too late. The world now knew who had written those words. The veterans knew who had turned their sacrifice into script. And Harry knew that his attempt at authenticity had backfired beyond repair. In one particularly painful interview weeks later, when asked about the Toronto event, Harry simply said, "Sometimes, things don't land the way you hope." It was the understatement of the century. Because what didn't land wasn't just the speech, it was his credibility. The Toronto speech had been exposed for what it truly was. A performance directed by someone who had never set foot on a battlefield, never held a dying comrade, never felt the weight of duty. And that's what made it so tragic. It wasn't just that Harry had lost the room. He'd lost the right to stand in it. But as devastating as that silence was, the aftermath would reveal something even more explosive. Because Jessica Irwin's involvement wasn't the final twist. There was another layer, a deeper one, involving someone much closer to Harry. Someone who didn't just approve the script, but demanded it. Someone who believed the veterans weren't the real audience that day. Because in her mind, Toronto wasn't about honoring the past, it was about rewriting it. And when her fingerprints were found all over the speech, even Harry's most loyal defenders couldn't deny what had become painfully obvious. This wasn't his failure alone. It was Meghan Markle's design. But how deep was her role? And what motivated her to turn a veteran's tribute into a branding exercise? The answer, buried in leaked production notes and internal memos, would shock even those who thought they'd seen everything from the Sussex saga. Because what came next would expose not just the manipulation behind one's speech, but the true extent of the Hollywood machine driving the Sussex image. They say silence is louder than words, but that day in Toronto, silence became a statement. What no applause, no cheer, and no reaction could convey in sound, it screamed in meaning. The veteran's silence wasn't confusion. It wasn't shyness. It was deliberate. It was a collective decision to say, without saying, we're not buying it. Because to those men and women who had lived through the hell of combat, who had seen friends fall and dreams fracture, authenticity is sacred, and the one thing they cannot tolerate is pretense. From the moment Prince Harry took the stage, they felt something was off. Maybe it was the rhythm, too clean, too calculated. Maybe it was his tone, smooth but soulless. Maybe it was the way his eyes flicked back and forth, following the teleprompter instead of the faces in front of him. Whatever it was, it triggered that sixth sense soldiers develop, the one that tells them when someone's bluffing. And to them, Harry's speech felt like a bluff. One of the veterans, a retired major named Daniel McNair, described it perfectly later during an interview with a Toronto radio station. I've seen raw emotion on the battlefield. I've seen men speak about pain without needing a script. What I saw that day was performance. You could feel it. It didn't come from the heart. The crowd of veterans that day wasn't small. Over 300 were present, men and women from different branches of service, different generations, different wars. Afghanistan, Iraq, Bosnia, even a few from the Gulf. Some were wheelchair-bound, some wore prosthetics, others still carried scars you couldn't see. They came not for glamour or gossip, but because they thought this would be a reunion of spirit, soldiers listening to one of their own. Instead, they got a prince acting like a politician. You could feel the collective deflation as the speech went on. A few heads tilted, a few eyes rolled, a few veterans whispered among themselves. Who wrote this crap? One reportedly said under his breath. It wasn't anger yet, it was disappointment. Because these were the same men and women who once saw Prince Harry as a symbol. He wasn't like the other royals. He'd served. He'd lived among them. He'd shared their jokes, their frustrations, their gallows humor. He'd built Invictus, not as a royal project, but as a brother-in-arms gesture. And now, it felt like all of that was gone. After the event, groups of veterans gathered outside the hall. Cigarettes lit, jackets zipped. The conversations were short but sharp. You could feel the frustration rippling through. What was that? One said. Did he even write it? Another asked. No way, replied a third. That's not the Harry we knew. Word spread fast. Within hours, private Facebook groups for veterans were buzzing with posts dissecting the speech. One former corporal wrote, I served in Helmand when he did. He used to speak from the gut. That speech sounded like it came from a marketing deck. The comments under it? Thousands of likes. Hundreds of replies echoing the same sentiment. Fake. Empty. Scripted. Veterans associations started receiving calls from members asking if they'd been briefed about who actually wrote the speech. One representative later admitted, I had no idea it wasn't his. I just assumed. Everyone did. And then came the moment that broke the dam, when Jessica Irwin's name leaked as the true author. For the veterans, it was personal now. It wasn't just about a speech. It was about being used. One veteran, Corporal Evan Clark, put it bluntly in an interview. We're not props. We're not here to help you fix your image. We're not your Netflix B-roll. You either mean it, or you don't stand up there at all. His words hit like shrapnel through social media. They were quoted, retweeted, clipped, and shared across forums. We're not your props became a rallying cry. The veterans' collective pushback against celebrity sincerity. And it stung. Because, for the first time, the people who had once defended Harry were now calling him out. For years, he'd been their advocate. He'd launched programs, raised funds, shown a global spotlight on invisible wounds. But now, they saw someone detached, distant from the cause he once embodied. There's a special kind of pain that comes when a hero disappoints you. It's heavier than anger, colder than hate. It's the kind of heartbreak you feel when someone who once spoke for you starts sounding like he's speaking about you. That's what the veterans felt that day. And it wasn't just the words, it was everything around them. The cameras, the lighting, the PR people pacing at the edges of the stage. The whole thing felt commercial. Too sleek. Too staged. One soldier later wrote anonymously on a veteran's blog. You could see the crew setting up like it was a movie scene. They weren't filming history. They were filming an episode. Another added, he didn't look at us once. Just the cameras. Like he was trying to connect with the lens, not the hearts in the room. The veteran's frustration didn't fade when the speech ended. It deepened. Over the next few days, veterans across Canada and the UK began writing open letters. Some were angry. Some were sorrowful. All were honest. One letter stood out among them, written by a retired British Army sergeant named Liam Foster. He'd served under Harry's command years earlier. In his letter, published online, he wrote, "I don't recognize the man I saw on that stage. The Harry I knew didn't need ghostwriters to talk about courage. He lived it. He didn't need scripts to honor the fallen. He felt it. What happened to that man?" The letter went viral, tens of thousands of shares in a day. And the public's sympathy, which had long leaned toward Harry as the outsider prince, began to shift. The veterans weren't attacking him. They were lamenting him. And that, ironically, hurt more. Because it wasn't hatred that echoed through their silence. It was grief. Grief for the man he used to be. The veteran's silence became a symbol. Media outlets began referring to it as the Toronto silence, using it as shorthand for a kind of collective rejection of inauthentic leadership. Editorials called it the most awkward royal moment of the decade. Others called it the day the veterans turned their backs. Behind the scenes, even Harry's old allies in the military community were struggling to defend him. A former Invictus organizer told one newspaper, "He's lost their trust. And once you lose trust in that world, it's almost impossible to earn back." Meanwhile, Meghan's camp reportedly scrambled to reshape the narrative, pitching the silence as a solemn moment of reflection. Acclaimed veterans publicly shot down. Reflection, one posted. You don't reflect by checking your phone and leaving. As days turned into weeks, the divide widened. Veterans began sharing clips of old Harry speeches. Raw, emotional ones from early Invictus Games events, side by side with the Toronto speech. The difference was staggering. In the old clips, Harry's voice cracked when he spoke about injured soldiers. His hands trembled when he recalled watching friends struggle. There was no teleprompter, no staging, no scripted pauses. Just a man speaking from his soul. In the Toronto video, he was calm, perfect, empty. One veteran summed it up perfectly. He used to talk with us. Now he talks at us. That single line captured the essence of the problem. Somewhere along the way, Harry had traded connection for control, vulnerability for polish, truth for branding. And that trade had cost him everything. Still, not everyone in that crowd hated him. Some pitied him. A few even defended him privately, saying, he's probably just surrounded by the wrong people. But the damage was done. For the veterans who'd once marched beside him, or cheered him from afar, the silence that day wasn't just about a bad speech. It was about betrayal. Betrayal of trust. Betrayal of memory. Betrayal of the belief that one of their own had risen to fame without forgetting where he came from. And while the veterans' side of the story spread like wildfire, there was one moment no one could forget. A single, subtle scene that captured the heartbreak better than any headline. A journalist caught it on camera, but it was cut from the official footage. After the speech, as the veterans stood to leave, one elderly man in uniform reached into his pocket, pulled out a small Invictus pin, looked at it for a long moment, and quietly dropped it into the trash bin beside his seat. No words. Just that. That image went viral within hours. A veteran discarding the symbol of something he once believed in. And that, more than anything, told the story. It wasn't that they hated Prince Harry. It was that they'd lost him. And maybe, he'd lost himself. But just as the silence started to fade from headlines, something unexpected happened. Something that reignited the entire controversy and pushed it into dangerous territory. Because the veteran side of the story wasn't the only one about to go public. An email, confidential, internal, never meant to see daylight, was about to surface. An email from a retired general who had been invited to the event but declined at the last minute. An email that revealed why he refused to attend. And when the contents of that letter came out, they wouldn't just explain the silence in Toronto, they'd expose a betrayal that reached far beyond that stage. Because this general's message didn't just criticize Harry's speech. The letter wasn't supposed to exist. It wasn't meant for journalists, the public, or the internet's relentless cycle of outrage. It was a private message, written quietly, sent to a small circle of veteran leaders 2 days before the Toronto event. But after the speech ended in silence, after the disappointment had boiled over, someone leaked it. And when it hit the press, the entire story shifted from embarrassment to betrayal. The author of that letter was retired Major General Andrew Talbot, a decorated war hero, a man known for his brutal honesty and his fierce loyalty to the troops. For years, he had been one of Prince Harry's biggest supporters, praising his authenticity and dedication to veterans. He'd worked closely with him during the early Invictus Games planning, even describing him once as a bridge between the uniformed and the royal. So when word spread that Talbot had declined his invitation to the Toronto event, eyebrows were raised. People assumed it was health-related. After all, he was nearing 70. But the truth, revealed in his letter, was far more explosive. The subject line read, "Declining with regret and concern." It began politely, even affectionately. "I have nothing but respect for what Prince Harry has done for our wounded, our lost, and our forgotten. But I cannot, in good conscience, attend an event that no longer feels rooted in the same spirit we once built Invictus upon." That opening line hit like artillery fire across social media when the letter was leaked. But what followed was even more damning. Talbot went on to explain that he had been approached weeks earlier by members of the organizing team for input on the event's tone. He said he was deeply unsettled by what he saw. "The brief I was shown," he wrote, "read less like a veteran's tribute and more like a brand launch. I saw words like optics, audience reach, and emotional resonance metrics. I asked where service, sacrifice, and duty were mentioned. They weren't." That line alone lit a fuse. It confirmed what many veterans had suspected all along. The Toronto event wasn't about honoring them. It was about marketing someone else. Talbot's letter continued, with the precision and gravity only a seasoned general could deliver. "I fear that what began as a movement of healing has been commercialized. The tone of recent communications indicates that the focus is now on personal redemption and public relations rather than genuine service. That is not what Invictus was created for, and it's not what our veterans deserve." He ended his letter with a quiet but devastating verdict. "I will not stand in a room that treats our stories as stage material. We are not content. We are not currency. We are soldiers." Those words, "We are not content. We are not currency," became the rallying cry for veterans worldwide. Within hours of the leak, hashtags like #WeAreNotContent and #TorontoSilence trended across platforms. For many, the letter articulated what they had been struggling to put into words, that they felt exploited, not celebrated. News outlets scrambled to verify the authenticity of the letter. When Talbot's assistant confirmed it was real, the backlash exploded. Major networks picked up the story. Newspapers ran headlines like, "General turns his back on Prince Harry, calls speech a PR stunt." Pundits debated whether Harry had truly lost his moral compass. Editorials framed the Toronto silence as a mutiny of the faithful. But perhaps the most striking response came from within Harry's own military circle. Several former Invictus ambassadors, people who had once stood proudly by his side, publicly expressed their disappointment. One of them, a double amputee who had competed in the first games, said during a BBC interview, "We always felt like Harry got it. He knew what it meant to hurt, to rebuild, to fight again. That's what made him one of us. But this speech, it didn't feel like him. It felt like someone else wearing his face." And then he paused. "I think the general was right not to go." That sentence, coming from someone who owed their recovery to Invictus, cut deeper than any tabloid headline could. Inside Archwell, panic reportedly erupted. Staffers were instructed to minimize response. Meghan's communications team drafted a statement emphasizing Prince Harry's lifelong commitment to veterans and service members. But by the time it was released, it sounded hollow, defensive rather than sincere, because no press release could undo the sting of that letter. Journalists began combing through old public records, speeches, and interviews, connecting dots that painted a troubling picture. It appeared that in recent years, Harry's involvement with veteran causes had quietly diminished. Attendance at military-related charity events had dropped. Direct engagement with wounded service members had become rare. The once hands-on prince had become a distant figurehead. Talbot's letter didn't just criticize a speech. It exposed a decline, a slow erosion of purpose beneath the glitter of celebrity. Even those who tried to defend Harry found themselves faltering. "He's been under immense pressure," one supporter said on television. "Maybe he's just lost sight of things." But that explanation fell flat. Because to veterans, losing sight of service isn't an excuse, it's a betrayal. And while public debate raged, veterans themselves began to act. Several organizations canceled upcoming collaborative projects with Archwell. The Royal British Legion reportedly reassessed their informal relationship. A Canadian veterans group issued a statement saying they would no longer participate in events that prioritize publicity over sincerity. The shockwave spread further when a second letter, this one internal, surfaced. It was from a Canadian Veterans Affairs officer who'd attended the Toronto event. She wrote, "When I saw the general's message, I understood why he stayed away. I wish I had too." Her words were brief, but haunting. Meanwhile, Harry remained silent. For days, he avoided public comment, choosing instead to attend private meetings in California. But silence, once again, spoke volumes. The longer he said nothing, the worse it got. When he finally broke his silence in a brief, heavily edited video interview weeks later, his response only deepened the divide. "General Talbot has been a great ally to veterans," he said, "and I respect his opinion. But my intentions were pure. I've always cared about those who serve. That hasn't changed." But by then, the damage was irreversible. The veterans didn't want intentions. They wanted authenticity. And that's when another bombshell dropped. An email exchange between Talbot and one of Harry's senior aides, sent before the Toronto event, was leaked to the press. In it, the aide asked the general for a brief endorsement statement to include in promotional materials. Talbot's reply was sharp. "Don't use my name to promote something that no longer reflects the values we once stood for." Invictus was about soldiers, not slogans. That single sentence went viral within hours. It was clear now, the veterans hadn't turned on Harry out of bitterness or disloyalty. They'd turned on him because they believed he'd turned his back first. And as public sympathy shifted toward the veterans, journalists began digging even deeper. They discovered that the Toronto speech was only one part of a larger redemption rollout. A strategic PR campaign tied to new deals, documentaries, and branded projects. Suddenly, the general's accusations didn't seem so far-fetched. Commentators started referring to it as the commercialization of compassion. Editorials accused Harry and Meghan of turning service into spectacle. One columnist wrote, "When applause becomes currency, silence is rebellion." And that's what those veterans gave him, a standing rebellion in the form of stillness. But the general's letter did something else too. It woke something up in the British press, a willingness to question what had once been untouchable, Harry's sincerity. For years, he'd been immune to criticism in military matters. Now, every word, every speech, every charity project was being re-examined under a harsher light. And perhaps the cruelest irony of all, the man who'd once built his public identity on being the royal who truly understood soldiers was now being described as the one who betrayed them the most. One veteran wrote in response to the letter, "He used to be our voice. Now he's just an echo." Those words hurt because they were true. Yet, there was one part of the letter that the media initially overlooked. A final paragraph, written almost as a warning. It read, "Mark my words. If those guiding him do not change course, he will lose everything he built. The veterans will forgive mistakes, but not dishonesty. If this continues, he won't just lose their support. He'll lose their respect." And that's a debt no amount of PR can repay. Looking back now, those words feel prophetic, because what came next proved the general right. The veterans' silence had been powerful enough. The letter had turned it into a movement. But the next revelation, what was about to come to light, would transform this quiet protest into a full-blown scandal. Because the leaked documents that surfaced next didn't just confirm the PR manipulation, they revealed the shocking extent of it. They exposed that the Toronto event had been planned months in advance, not as an independent veterans celebration, but as part of a larger media operation, with talking points